August 17, 1969. As Jimi Hendrix's psychedelic version of The Star-Spangled Banner echoed across the muddy fields of Bethel, New York, 20-year-old William Montgomery IV stood among 500,000 other young souls at Woodstock, holding his Selective Service registration card in trembling hands. The grandson of a Federal Reserve Board member and son of Manhattan's most prestigious investment banker, William had been groomed since birth to follow in the family tradition of financial power and political influence. His Ivy League education, his trust fund, his connections to senators and Supreme Court justices, everything had been carefully orchestrated to ensure his place among America's ruling elite. But as Country Joe McDonald's anti-war anthem, "I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die" rag began to play in the distance, William realized that he could no longer participate in a system that was sending young men his age to die in a war he had come to believe was fundamentally immoral. What happened next would transform him from a privileged heir to Wall Street royalty into one of the most dedicated anti-war activists of his generation, ultimately leading him to discover a calling that would define the rest of his life. William's upbringing had been everything that American wealth and privilege could provide. The Montgomery family mansion on Fifth Avenue was filled with original artwork, first-edition books, and the constant presence of political and financial leaders who shaped national policy over cocktails and cigars. William had attended the finest private schools, where he excelled academically while participating in debate team, lacrosse, and student government activities that prepared him for leadership roles in the establishment his family represented. His father, William Montgomery III, was a man who believed that wealth came with the responsibility to guide society, and he had raised his son to view their privileged position as both a blessing and a duty. "The Montgomery family has been serving this country for 4 generations," his father often reminded him. "We don't just accumulate wealth, we use it to maintain the stability and prosperity that benefits everyone." The first cracks in William's faith in the system had begun during his sophomore year at Harvard, where he was majoring in economics and political science in preparation for his expected career in finance and government. His roommate, David Goldberg, was a scholarship student from Brooklyn, whose working-class background provided a perspective on American society that William had never encountered. David's father had died in Korea, and his older brother was currently serving in Vietnam, fighting in a war that David increasingly questioned. "My brother is risking his life to stop the spread of communism," David told William during one of their late-night discussions. "But he's also protecting the economic interests of guys like your father, who profit from defense contracts while other people's sons do the dying." The comment had stung William because he recognized its truth. His family's bank held significant investments in companies that manufactured weapons and military supplies. The campus anti-war movement had initially seemed foreign and threatening to William, whose patriotic upbringing had taught him to view military service as honorable and protests as unpatriotic. But as the body count in Vietnam mounted and stories of American atrocities began to emerge, William found himself attending teach-ins and protest rallies, listening to speakers who challenged everything he had been taught about American foreign policy. The turning point came when he attended a presentation by a Vietnam veteran who described the reality of combat in graphic detail, explaining how young soldiers were being asked to fight an unwinnable war against people who were defending their homeland. "We're not the good guys in this story," the veteran had said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We're the invaders, the aggressors, the ones who are dropping napalm on villages and calling it freedom." William's growing disillusionment with the war had created increasing tension with his father, who viewed the anti-war movement as naive idealism that would pass once William matured and understood the complexities of international relations. "Son, you're allowing your emotions to override your intelligence," William III had said during one of their increasingly heated arguments. "The world is a dangerous place, and sometimes military action is necessary to protect our way of life. Your grandfather helped finance the war effort that defeated fascism, and I'm proud to support the struggle against communist expansion." But William could no longer accept these explanations, especially after learning about the Pentagon Papers and the government lies that had escalated American involvement in Southeast Asia. He began to see his family's wealth and influence as part of the problem rather than the solution. The decision to attend Woodstock had been made impulsively, against his father's explicit wishes, and in defiance of the summer internship at Goldman Sachs that was supposed to prepare him for his future career. William had driven up from Manhattan in his BMW, feeling like an imposter among the Volkswagen buses and hitchhikers who made up the festival's primary demographic. His neat appearance and expensive clothes marked him as an outsider in a gathering that celebrated counterculture values. But something about the music and the energy of the crowd had gradually drawn him in. For 3 days, he had experienced a sense of community and shared purpose that was completely different from the competitive, hierarchical environment he had known all his life. "These people actually care about peace," he wrote in his journal. "They're not just talking about it at dinner parties, they're living it." The moment that changed everything came during Country Joe McDonald's performance of his satirical anti-war song, when the musician invited audience members to burn their draft cards as an act of protest against the Vietnam War. William watched as dozens of young men stepped forward, producing their selective service cards and setting them ablaze while the crowd cheered in support. The gesture was both symbolic and dangerous. Draft card burning was a federal crime that could result in 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. But as William listened to the lyrics mocking the war and watched his peers risk imprisonment to protest what they saw as immoral government policy, he felt a clarity and conviction that he had never experienced before. His hand moved to his wallet, where his own draft card waited like a symbol of everything he could no longer accept about his predetermined life. Before you continue this incredible journey of transformation and moral awakening with us, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of courage, conviction, and the power of music to change the world. The act of burning his draft card felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. As William stepped forward and held his selective service registration over someone's lighter, he knew he was not just destroying a piece of paper, he was rejecting the path his family had laid out for him, defying federal law, and choosing to align himself with a movement that his father considered treasonous. The flames consumed the card quickly, but the symbolism lingered like smoke in the air around him. He was no longer William Montgomery IV, future investment banker and establishment insider. He had become something new, something undefined, something that would have to be created rather than inherited. The crowd around him erupted in cheers and applause, welcoming him into a brotherhood of resistance that transcended class and background. The immediate aftermath of his draft card burning was a mixture of exhilaration and terror. William had committed a federal crime in front of thousands of witnesses, some of whom were likely recording the event for posterity. But more importantly, he had crossed a psychological and moral line that made it impossible to return to his old life unchanged. As he walked through the festival grounds after McDonald's performance, other attendees approached him with congratulations and words of support. "Welcome to the revolution, brother," said a long-haired young man who introduced himself as Peace. "You just took the first step toward becoming who you're really meant to be." The words resonated with William because they captured something he had been feeling but couldn't articulate, that his privileged upbringing had been preparing him for a life that wasn't actually his own. The drive back to Manhattan at the end of Woodstock felt like traveling between two different worlds. As William's BMW carried him from the muddy fields of Bethel back to the sterile luxury of Fifth Avenue, he struggled to process the magnitude of what he had experienced and what he had done. The festival had shown him an alternative vision of American society, one based on cooperation rather than competition, love rather than fear, peace rather than war. But he also knew that returning to his family and his expected role would mean pretending that nothing had changed, continuing to prepare for a career that now seemed morally reprehensible. The draft card burning had been an act of defiance, but it had also been a commitment, a promise to himself and to the movement that he would find a way to live according to his newfound values. The confrontation with his father was inevitable and explosive. William III's rage at his son's criminal stupidity was matched only by his fear of the scandal that would result if William's draft card burning became public knowledge. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" his father shouted, his usual composure cracking under the weight of disappointment and anger. "You've thrown away everything this family has worked for, everything we've built for you. You've aligned yourself with communists and criminals who want to destroy everything that made this country great." But William found that his father's fury no longer intimidated him the way it once had. Woodstock had shown him that there were values more important than family approval, causes worth sacrificing comfort and security to support. The ultimatum came within a week. William could publicly recant his anti-war views, accept deferment from military service through his father's political connections, and return to his expected path toward Wall Street success, or he could be cut off financially and socially from everything the Montgomery family represented. "The choice is yours, son," his father said, his voice cold with controlled anger. "But if you choose to continue this destructive path, you'll do it without our name, our money, or our support. You'll discover very quickly how difficult life can be without the privileges you've always taken for granted." William's response surprised both of them with its calm certainty. "I understand, Father, and I choose to live according to my conscience, whatever the cost." As he walked out of the family mansion that evening, carrying only a duffel bag of clothes and his small personal savings account, William Montgomery IV officially ceased to exist. In his place was someone new, someone who would have to discover his purpose and identity through his own choices rather than inherited expectations. William's transformation from privileged heir to committed activist began with his decision to adopt the name Will Peace and immerse himself completely in the anti-war movement that had captured his conscience at Woodstock. Moving into a cramped shared apartment in the East Village with 3 other draft resistors, Will experienced poverty for the first time in his life, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, eating rice and beans when money was scarce, wearing secondhand clothes that would have horrified his former social circle. But the material hardships were offset by a sense of purpose and authenticity that he had never found in his privileged existence. "I finally know who I am," he wrote to David Goldberg, his former Harvard roommate who had become his closest confidant. "I'm not just the product of someone else's expectations. I'm a person with my own values and my own mission." The anti-war movement in 1969 was a complex network of organizations ranging from moderate peace groups to radical revolutionary cells, united by opposition to the Vietnam War, but divided on tactics and ultimate goals. Will threw himself into this world with the passion of a convert, volunteering for multiple organizations, attending every protest and teach-in he could find, and using his Ivy League education to write articulate pamphlets and position papers that helped legitimize the movement's arguments. His upper-class background and articulate speaking style made him particularly valuable for outreach to moderate audiences who might dismiss the movement if represented only by long-haired radicals. "Will can talk to straight people in their own language," explained Maria Santos, an organizer with Students for a Democratic Society, who became one of his closest allies. "He helps them understand that opposition to the war isn't just hippie craziness, it's moral necessity." The work was both exhilarating and dangerous. Will participated in numerous civil disobedience actions that resulted in arrests and jail time, using his legal knowledge and family connections to help other activists navigate the court system while facing his own federal charges for draft card destruction. The FBI had opened a file on him within months of his departure from the Montgomery family, and he lived with the constant awareness that his phone might be tapped, his mail intercepted, his associates under surveillance. But these risks seemed insignificant compared to the moral urgency he felt about stopping a war that was killing thousands of Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers every month. "If we don't act now," he told audiences at anti-war rallies, "we become complicit in genocide. Silence is collaboration with evil." Will's most important relationship during this period was with Maria Santos, a brilliant organizer whose working-class Chicano background provided a perspective on American inequality that complemented his growing understanding of international injustice. Maria had been politicized by witnessing how the war disproportionately affected poor and minority communities, whose sons were drafted while wealthy families like Will's found ways to avoid military service. Their romantic relationship developed alongside their political partnership, creating a bond that was both personal and ideological. "Maria taught me that the war wasn't just wrong because it was violent," Will reflected years later. "It was wrong because it was part of a system that treated some people's lives as more valuable than others. She helped me understand that true peace required justice, not just the absence of conflict." The couple's work together led them to some of the most significant anti-war protests of the era, including the March on Washington in November 1969 and the Kent State demonstrations in May 1970. Will's ability to articulate complex political arguments in accessible language made him a sought-after speaker, while Maria's organizational skills and grassroots connections helped mobilize the working-class constituencies that gave the movement its power. They collaborated on an influential pamphlet called "The Class War Behind the Vietnam War," that explained how the conflict served the interests of wealthy elites, while poor Americans did the fighting and dying. The publication was widely distributed and helped broaden the movement's appeal beyond college campuses to include labor unions, churches, and community organizations. The tragic shootings at Kent State University in May 1970, where National Guard troops killed 4 student protesters, marked a turning point both for the anti-war movement and for Will's personal development. He and Maria had been at Kent State just days before the shootings, helping to organize the protests against the invasion of Cambodia that had triggered the campus unrest. The knowledge that they could easily have been among the victims gave new urgency to their work and deepened their commitment to nonviolent resistance. "Violence only begets more violence," Will told a memorial service for the slain students. "Our best revenge against those who would silence us with bullets is to multiply our voices, to make our truth so clear and so powerful that it cannot be ignored or suppressed." The emotional toll of constant activism, combined with the stress of living under FBI surveillance and the strain of financial hardship, began to affect Will's physical and mental health by early 1971. He was suffering from chronic insomnia, anxiety attacks, and a persistent sense that his individual efforts were insignificant compared to the magnitude of the problems he was trying to address. The anti-war movement was fracturing into competing factions, some of which were embracing violent tactics that Will found morally objectionable. His relationship with Maria was also suffering under the pressure of their intense political involvement and their different approaches to balancing personal happiness with political commitment. "I feel like I'm burning out," he confided to David during one of their increasingly rare phone conversations. "I believe in the cause more than ever, but I'm not sure I can maintain this level of intensity indefinitely." The crisis that forced Will to reevaluate his approach to activism came when he was arrested during a particularly violent protest outside the Democratic National Convention in Miami Beach in July 1972. Unlike his previous arrests for peaceful civil disobedience, this incident involved charges of inciting a riot and assault on a police officer, accusations that were false but carried the potential for serious prison time. Sitting in a Miami jail cell, facing the possibility of years in federal prison, Will experienced what he later described as a spiritual awakening. "I realized that I had become so focused on fighting against things that I had lost sight of what I was fighting for," he wrote in his journal. "I was full of anger and righteousness, but I had forgotten about love, compassion, and the positive vision that had originally motivated my activism." The revelation that changed Will's life came through a conversation with his cellmate, an older civil rights activist named Reverend James Washington, who had been arrested while protesting racial discrimination in Miami's hotel industry. Reverend Washington listened patiently as Will poured out his frustrations and doubts, then offered a perspective that challenged Will's assumptions about effective activism. "Son, you can't build a peaceful world through angry methods," the minister said gently. "You can't create love through hatred, even hatred of injustice. The means you use determine the ends you achieve. If you want to create a society based on compassion and understanding, you have to embody those qualities in your own actions and your own life." The conversation with Reverend Washington sparked a period of deep reflection that continued long after Will's release from jail. He began to study the writings of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and other advocates of nonviolent social change, discovering philosophical frameworks that helped him understand how personal transformation and political activism could be integrated rather than kept separate. He also began practicing meditation and exploring Eastern spiritual traditions that emphasized inner peace as the foundation for creating external change. "I had been trying to change the world without changing myself," he realized. "But you can't give what you don't have. If I wanted to create peace in the world, I needed to find peace within myself first." The shift in Will's approach to activism coincided with major changes in his personal life. His relationship with Maria ended amicably as they recognized that their paths were diverging. She remained committed to traditional political organizing, while he was moving toward a more spiritually oriented approach to social change. He also made the difficult decision to reduce his involvement with the more militant anti-war organizations, focusing instead on groups that emphasized education, community building, and nonviolent resistance. "I'm not abandoning the movement," he explained to concerned friends who worried that he was losing his edge. "I'm trying to help it evolve into something more sustainable and more aligned with the values we claim to represent." The discovery of his true calling came through his work with Vietnam Veterans Against the War, where he helped returning soldiers process their war experiences and adjust to civilian life. Unlike many anti-war activists who viewed veterans as either victims or villains, Will approached them with genuine curiosity about their experiences and respect for their service, even while opposing the war they had fought. His combination of political sophistication and personal compassion made him uniquely effective at helping veterans navigate the complex emotions surrounding their military service and their growing opposition to the conflict. "These men have seen war up close," Will told a gathering of peace activists. "They understand its reality in ways that those of us who avoided service cannot. Their voices carry a credibility and authenticity that can end this war more effectively than all our protests combined." The work with veterans revealed Will's natural gifts as a counselor and healer, talents that had been hidden beneath his privileged upbringing and his years of angry activism. He discovered that he had an intuitive ability to create safe spaces where traumatized soldiers could process their experiences without judgment, helping them find meaning and purpose in their suffering while channeling their disillusionment into constructive action. Several veterans credited Will with saving their lives by helping them avoid suicide or addiction, and his reputation as a gifted counselor began to spread throughout the anti-war community. "Will has something special," observed Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who worked with anti-war veterans. "He understands that healing trauma requires more than just talking about it. It requires transforming pain into purpose, converting suffering into service to others." The formal end of the Vietnam War in 1975 marked both a victory for the anti-war movement and a crisis of purpose for activists like Will, who had defined themselves primarily in opposition to the conflict. As American troops withdrew from Southeast Asia and the draft was discontinued, many in the peace movement struggled to find new directions for their energy and commitment. But Will had already begun transitioning toward what would become his life's work, helping individuals and communities heal from trauma while building the psychological and spiritual foundations necessary for lasting peace. His experiences with Vietnam veterans had taught him that ending wars was only the first step toward creating a peaceful world. The deeper challenge was addressing the fear, hatred, and unhealed trauma that made violence seem inevitable and necessary. Will's evolution from political activist to spiritual teacher and counselor was gradual but purposeful. He spent 2 years studying with various meditation teachers and spiritual guides, learning techniques for working with trauma, addiction, and psychological healing that complemented his political understanding of social change. He also completed formal training in counseling and psychology, earning credentials that would allow him to work professionally with individuals and groups seeking healing from war trauma, domestic violence, and other forms of suffering. "I realized that politics without spirituality tends toward fanaticism," he explained to former colleagues who questioned his shift away from direct political action. "But spirituality without politics tends toward irrelevance. I'm trying to find a path that honors both the inner work of personal transformation and the outer work of social justice." The Healing Center that Will established in 1977 in rural Vermont became a model for integrating psychological therapy, spiritual practice, and social activism in service of comprehensive healing. The center, called Peace Valley, offered residential programs for Vietnam veterans, workshops on nonviolent conflict resolution, retreats for activists suffering from burnout, and training programs for counselors working with trauma survivors. Will's approach emphasized that personal healing and social change were inseparable, that individuals couldn't find lasting peace while living in an unjust society, but that society couldn't become just while composed of unhealed, traumatized individuals. "We have to work on both levels simultaneously," he taught his students. "We have to heal our own hearts while working to heal the heart of the world." The success of Peace Valley attracted attention from psychologists, social workers, and spiritual teachers around the world who were interested in Will's innovative approaches to trauma healing. His integration of Eastern meditation practices with Western psychotherapy, combined with his emphasis on social justice and community building, created a model that was adopted by numerous other healing centers and therapeutic programs. Will began traveling internationally to teach his methods, working with survivors of political oppression, war refugees, and communities recovering from ethnic conflict. His book, From Protest to Peace, A Veteran Activist's Guide to Healing and Social Change, became required reading in numerous graduate programs in psychology, social work, and peace studies. Will's personal life during this period was marked by deep relationships and meaningful partnerships that reflected his growth as both an individual and a healer. He married Sarah Chen, a psychologist and fellow peace activist whom he met during his training period, and together they created a family that embodied the values of compassion, justice, and conscious living that guided their work. Their 2 children grew up at Peace Valley, learning from an early age that their privilege and advantages came with responsibilities to serve others and work for positive change in the world. We're trying to raise children who understand that true security comes not from accumulating wealth or power, Sarah explained, but from contributing to the healing and well-being of the larger human community. The 1980s brought new challenges and opportunities as the Reagan administration's military buildup and intervention in Central America created fresh urgency around peace and justice issues. Will found himself drawn back into more direct political activism, but with a different approach than he had taken during his angry youth. Instead of simply opposing government policies, he focused on creating positive alternatives, developing conflict resolution programs that could be used in international diplomacy, training peace activists in nonviolent resistance techniques, and building coalitions that brought together diverse constituencies around shared values of human dignity and social justice. Effective activism requires both resistance and reconstruction, he taught workshops for young activists. We have to say no to what's wrong while simultaneously creating examples of what's right. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Cold War created new possibilities for the kind of global cooperation and conflict resolution that Will had been advocating for 2 decades. He was invited to participate in numerous international peace conferences and reconciliation processes, bringing his expertise in trauma healing to communities recovering from ethnic conflict, civil war, and political oppression. His work in post-apartheid South Africa, war-torn Bosnia, and genocide-affected Rwanda demonstrated that the principles he had developed for healing American veterans could be adapted to address collective trauma on a massive scale. Truth and reconciliation processes are essential, he observed after working with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but they're only the beginning. Real healing requires sustained commitment to addressing the underlying conditions that make violence possible. The recognition that came with Will's international work included numerous awards and honors, but perhaps the most meaningful acknowledgement came from his estranged father, who reached out in 1995 to express his pride in his son's accomplishments and his regret about their long separation. William Montgomery III, now in his 80s and facing his own mortality, had begun to question some of the assumptions that had guided his life and career. "I may not understand all of your choices," he wrote to Will, "but I can see that you've used your privileges and advantages to serve something larger than yourself. Perhaps that's what I was trying to teach you all along, even though I went about it in the wrong way." The reconciliation between father and son was emotional and healing for both men, demonstrating that even the deepest ideological differences could be bridged through honest communication and mutual respect. The new millennium brought fresh challenges as global terrorism, climate change, and economic inequality created new forms of trauma and conflict that required innovative approaches to healing and peacebuilding. Will, now in his 50s, and recognized as one of the world's leading experts on trauma and social change, found himself busier than ever as communities around the world sought his guidance in addressing collective suffering and building resilience. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, particularly tested his commitment to nonviolence and compassion as he worked with survivors, first responders, and families affected by the tragedy, while also advocating for responses that would not perpetuate cycles of violence and revenge. The Peace Valley model had by this time been replicated in dozens of locations around the world, creating a global network of healing centers that shared Will's integrated approach to personal and social transformation. The young man who had burned his draft card at Woodstock had become an elder in a movement that combined the idealism of the 1960s counterculture with the practical wisdom gained through decades of hands-on work with trauma and conflict. "The revolution we dreamed of in the 60s is still happening," Will told audiences at the numerous conferences and workshops he addressed. "It's just taking a different form than we expected. Instead of overthrowing the system through political action, we're transforming it from within by healing the fear and trauma that make violence and oppression seem necessary." Will's legacy was not just the institutions he had built or the individuals he had helped heal, but the model he had created for living an integrated life that honored both personal authenticity and social responsibility. His journey from privileged banker's son to committed activist to spiritual teacher and healer, demonstrated that it was possible to transform anger into compassion, protest into peace-building, and personal privilege into service to the common good. The draft card he had burned at Woodstock had been a symbol of rejection of war, of inherited expectations, of a life lived according to other people's values. But the life he had built in its place was a symbol of affirmation of peace, of conscious choice, of the possibility that individuals could change not just themselves, but the world around them. In his later years, Will often reflected on the moment at Woodstock when he had made the choice that defined the rest of his life. The frightened young man who had stood in that muddy field, holding a draft card that represented everything he could no longer accept, had made a decision that seemed purely destructive at the time. But that act of destruction had actually been an act of creation, the beginning of a life dedicated to healing, peace, and the transformation of suffering into wisdom. Sometimes, he would tell the young activists and healers who came to learn from him, you have to burn down who you've been in order to discover who you're meant to become. The fire that destroys the false self illuminates the true self that was always waiting to be born. The banker's son who had burned his draft card at Woodstock had found his true calling not in the dramatic gesture of that single moment, but in the patient, persistent work of building a more peaceful world, one healed heart at a time. His story had become part of the larger narrative of his generation's struggle to create a society based on love rather than fear, cooperation rather than competition, healing rather than harm. And, in the end, perhaps that was the most important revolution of all, not the overthrow of external systems, but the transformation of consciousness that made new systems possible. The peace that Will had helped create in the world was ultimately a reflection of the peace he had found within himself, proving that the personal truly was political and that changing the world began with changing oneself.